Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to 1% Better, where we take a look at hidden stories in sport. I'm your host, Dr. David Lippman, and of course, this is episode 4 of our energy series with Aitor Viribay. So, once again, thank you to Aitor for his time, and please do go follow along Aitor's endeavors. Go follow me on social media, go look in our show notes. There are links to Aitor everywhere there. So, I'd encourage you to go follow him there. Again, let him know that you've enjoyed the podcast, whether you post about it on social or something like that is great. Do let us know what you think as well. So again, emails or Strava group, Spotify comments, YouTube comments, all of that stuff. Of course, rating the podcast helps us as well, more generally than specifically. Obviously, specifically, we'd like to know what you think of this series, but we'd love to know generally how you're doing, what you think of the podcast, etc. It does help us grow as well. So do want to thank you there and ask you to do that up front. Today's episode with Aitor is all about lactate. So this is going to be great. People are going to enjoy this. I think it's very accessible, but always happy to have Aitor back on if you have questions, or please do let us know if you do and send them through and we can answer them ourselves. We can ask Aitor, all of the above. But this is an accessible episode. I think you'll all enjoy this, learn a lot about something that's, there's a lot of misconceptions around lactate. I think we do a good job of dispelling a lot of them. And one thing I did want to note, it's something Aitor actually said to me that we should have done better in the episode when we got off, was that we didn't really talk about endogenous versus exogenous lactate. What you'll notice is the first portion of the podcast is very focused on what is called endogenous lactate, which is basically lactate that's in our body already. Endogenous means it's already in there. Exogenous is something that we take. So, for instance, when we make new glycogen, right, through gluconeogenesis, that is endogenous carbohydrate, whereas exogenous would be a gel that you take, for instance. So that's really important because the two are different. And one of the things that Aitor wanted to emphasize was that when we create endogenous lactate, there's a cost to that, which is to say, it's not a waste product, but it's certainly nothing's for free, right? We can't create or destroy energy. We just change its form. So it's not free. Whereas when we're taking it exogenously, then it certainly doesn't cost us anything to make that. Now, of course, it costs us money to buy it and we have to take it and all those things. But in terms of energetically, there isn't a cost to making it. So it's a little bit more beneficial for us from an energetic standpoint. That said, there are always risks to taking things or whatever else, right? I mean, there are secondary consequences and all that sort of stuff. So what I'm not saying is there's a free lunch. What I am saying is that energetically it's a little bit different and it acts slightly differently as well. So we just wanted to make that very clear up front with respect to endogenous versus exogenous lactate. You will notice we talk a lot about exogenous lactate in this because it's an exciting area of development. So with that all said, I do want to thank Precision Fuel and Hydration, one of our sponsors on this podcast. They've been with us from day one, actually. They're really good to us, started with us early. They will help you with a fueling plan. If you want a fueling plan, you can speak to one of their sports science consultants, book a call with them. Those calls are free and they are obligation free. They will explain things to you. They'll answer questions for you. They'll do all that. If you prefer talking to an algorithm, you can certainly use their fuel and hydration planner and put in details of your race and paces and all those sort of things, and it will spit out some recommendations for you for a fueling plan. You can certainly do the second and then go do the first with it. I think that would of course be helpful if you want to do that as well there. So you can get to that from our show notes. We've got the fuel and hydration planner link in our show notes, which will automatically apply the discount they've given our fans or our listeners kindly. It's a 15% discount on your first order. You can follow that link in the show notes and that will apply it automatically. Alternately, you can use the code BETTER, BETTER, all in capital letters, 2026 to get a discount on that. That is all of a full order from them. That'll be whatever you want to buy. You can get electrolytes, carbohydrates, gels, chews, all of it. So do go ahead and do that, particularly if you're heading into racing season anytime soon or into a big block of training. The other sponsor we have in this podcast, Stride Running Power Meters. Really appreciate Stride's support. They've been with us for just around a year now. I've been using them for much longer than that. Really enjoy the people at the company, but certainly the product itself. I found it to be quite interesting, particularly with respect to my rehab and progress in that. I know it's something they do quite a bit of, and people often seek them out for asymmetries in gait. So they obviously have a left and right that you can get. You can get the Stride Duo, and what that means is that you can then look for left-right imbalances that develop within a run, how that fatigue manifests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that is one of the strongest features that we have in running, is really understanding this, particularly from a clinical standpoint. I've spoken to them quite a bit, and they are targeting runners, not practitioners. So it's not something that they're going to make available for practitioners at this point. But that my confidence in that conversation that I had with them should speak to what I think of it clinically, which is, I think it's a good product in that respect to be able to see those asymmetries and really understand how things change across a run. I think this sort of testing in the real world is where the future lies. I think, labs are great, video game analysis, all that's great, but being able to go into the real world and see what happens as you run your marathon and see when things start to fall apart, or on your long run where things start to hurt, what's going on, I think that's really invaluable. You can take it into the field with you. These things are easy to move between shoes. So yeah, highly recommend Stride. Appreciate their support of the podcast. Do go check them out. So all of that is said, do enjoy this episode on lactate. Please do share this. I think this is a podcast that will serve a lot of people well. So please do help us share the message here. So that's engaging with us on social, that's sharing it on social, rating the podcast, sharing, commenting on it on YouTube or on Spotify, or all of the above. So without taking any more of your time, here is Aitor Viribay. Aitor Viribay is the Global Sports Performance Director at Salomon, a human performance consultant at Real Sociedad, co-founder and chief scientific officer at Lab to Field, co-founder and researcher at MedHub, and founder and director at Glute for Science. Aitor is joining us again today in the fourth episode of our what we're calling the Energy Series. So if you haven't checked out the other episodes, go back and do that. We've talked about how to build a performance environment. We've talked about energy expenditure. We've talked about carbohydrates. So those will all be linked in the episode description here or they'll be linked to our Spotify account. One of them is audio only, so they won't all be on YouTube, unfortunately. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, you'll have to go back through our feed and find them as well. But they are all there, so do go back and check those out. They're not necessary, but I think they're helpful for people to understand all of this. So yes. Anyway, before we go too much more there, firstly, thanks again for joining us, Aitor.
Hello, David. Thank you.
And today, I'm really excited about this. We've been doing quite a bit of work in the background on this episode, making sure that we're sort of aligned on it and that. And I'm excited about it because I think it's going to make a big difference here. I spoke a little bit of time ago on that triathlon show presented by Scientific Triathlon with Michael Erickson there. And I was really excited about exogenous lactate coming. And today we're going to talk about lactate and some exogenous lactate as well. So with that as a preface, I think the common thing you have to write these days when you write about lactate, or say these days when you talk about lactate, is it's not a waste product, right? That's what we have to say, because this myth is pervasive. So what is lactate then? If it's not a waste product, how would you explain lactate to people?
Probably as you said, I think we've got enough knowledge right now, thanks to big researchers in the topic, to leave behind that adjective of waste, that element of lactate being a waste, or being that element that creates fatigue or makes your muscle hard and all that. So hopefully we're moving forward on that, and I think mostly thanks to Gladden, Brooks, Rabinovich, these guys, Inigo Samian, of course, like the knowledge around lactate is now established in another direction, and that direction is we know lactate is a preferential source of energy for the body. It is the main gluconeogenic precursor, and it is also what they call it, the kind of lacto hormone. That it means it has properties when it comes to signaling or kind of deciding things internally in the cell. For example, when lactate is available, it can help with that, or it can trigger different substrate partitioning, and that's what they call it, signaling, or it can signal different epigenetic related pathways. So that's the reason why, some years ago, Brooks, he published this very famous and kind of groundbreaking paper, which he said there are three elements to lactate, and is a preferential source of energy, a gluconeogenic precursor, the main one in the body, and a signaling molecule. And that's where I think we need to frame lactate right now. And probably if you look at it from that angle, there are many possibilities and windows that are being opened to understand lactate.
Yeah, I think it's a great summary. Let's take a step back. So historically, the misnomer of it being a waste product was because lactate was high when hydrogen ions were being produced, and the hydrogen ions were changing pH, and this was part of what was driving fatigue in some aspects. And we probably changed our understanding of fatigue as well, and that is one way to induce fatigue in some time domains. There are other ways in other domains that we won't go into, but let's go back to, I guess, metabolism. It's an area you're very good in and very strong in. Like, let's talk about how we get to lactate, and then we can talk about how it then goes and behaves from there. So we sort of highlighted top level what are the roles it plays, but how do we get lactate, I guess? Like when is it produced and how do we get there metabolically?
Okay, can I say something before that? Because I've got an
Yeah,
analogy to really, and it's not my example. It's one of my friends, Adrian Castillo. He always used to use this example that if we bring someone from Mars, like extraterrestrial, I don't know how to say that, and
yep,
they come and they see an accident and they see the ambulance. Every accident they see the ambulance, and they're gonna conclude that the ambulance is probably part of that accident or creating that accident, because every time that I see an accident, it's always the ambulance there. But we know that the ambulance is there because it's taking care of the people who got injured in that accident. That's a good analogy, I think, to understand lactate. We have seen for years the ambulance as the problem of the accident, as the kind of the generator of that accident, whereas it is probably helping. It is in that crime scene more helping rather than creating the problem.
that's a great analogy.
Yeah, I love it. Adrian was very very smart as well when he came up with that. Yeah, well, lactate is a byproduct of breaking down glucose, which is one of the, if not the most kind of abundant pathways that we use or the most common pathways that we use in our metabolism. That's pretty unfair to say that lactate is only a byproduct, but essentially you produce lactate continuously through glycolysis. So every time that you break down glucose to that multiple step process that is called glycolysis, you end up with a pyruvate that is converted into lactate immediately. And that's the reason why they say lactate is the end product of glycolysis, the real end product of glycolysis. That's more on a cellular level, but reality is that we produce lactate, depending on the fiber types of muscles or depending on the different cells, etc. So bringing that into the muscle kind of centric point, we're gonna, as you probably know, but like bold summary, we've got some fiber types that they produce lactate, some others, or mostly preferentially produce lactate, some others that preferentially oxidize or clear up that lactate. And there's always that balance in the body that we're going to be producing lactate somewhere and oxidizing lactate or clearing the lactate up somewhere else. And in the meantime, whatever happens there, all that is possible to the theory of lactate shuttle, that we know lactate can travel as a kind of as we say in Spanish, a white horse, which is like someone that can go everywhere without paying the taxes. You know what I mean? And that molecule can travel through the body, and the reality is that it is very versatile. It can travel through different membranes very easily with high affinity. So that's the reason why it is very important. There are many examples to understand that. One of them that I love, and Brooks explains very well in his papers, is the glucose paradox. So that is, glucose, rather than sometimes being oxidized and being used as like breakdown into pyruvate and being used, it is producing lactate, and that lactate travels again back to the liver and is creating more glucose. So it is paradoxical, the fact that the body is spending so much energy to create lactate when it should be more efficient just to use glucose directly. So of course the body is investing more energy on that for a reason, and because lactate is not only a fuel product, but it's also a signaling molecule that is playing different kind of games at the same time. But just to summarize, we continuously produce lactate somewhere in the body through glycolysis, and we clear lactate somewhere else in the body through mitochondrial, through the OXPHOS system. Whatever happens in the meantime, that's what we normally know. That is, we normally measure with the blood concentration, okay, which is something very important to understand, that we are measuring a volumetric variable. So that means that it depends on the volume, and therefore it's a concentration. So it depends on both kind of the input and the output. But that's, I don't know, I'm not an expert in lactate, like on the kind of mechanisms of lactate, but that's the way I could explain to myself so I could really understand it.
Yeah, and I'll double click on a few things there. So when you say volumetric, you mean that it is a concentration. It's you can have a higher lactate measure in the blood by having less blood or more lactate.
Correct.
And so we actually don't know how much lactate is in the blood. We have no idea of the amount there. We just know that it's a concentration. And that concentration is a reflection of both like the net outcome of production and utilization locally, and then we end up shuttling lactate around in the blood to go elsewhere and be used elsewhere, right? So that's when we start to see lactate thresholds, and when you're being tested, we overwhelm local metabolism, it starts to become more systemic, and then eventually you sort of overwhelm systemic metabolism, you get an accumulation to some degree. And again, overwhelm might be the wrong word, because it's not like it's a bad thing, it's just it's not being used. We overwhelm our ability to use it, I guess. And this is why in elite athletes, particularly endurance athletes, particularly longer duration endurance athletes, say elite cyclists, you actually won't see high lactate values because they're so efficient at utilizing it. So the lactate curve looks completely different to, say, a CrossFit athlete who produces a lot and
Yeah.
maybe isn't quite as efficient with it. So there's some things there to consider. So where we are, we produce lactate at all times. So what organs and tissues use lactate? So where can we use it?
I could say everywhere. Where you have mitochondria, you're constantly using lactate. But there are some, especially during the exercise or in high demands of kind of ATP turnover, there are some tissues that they have when there is enough lactate available, and that's something that has been demonstrated through infusions, for example. They shift their metabolism to use more that lactate, and that's the example of the heart, for example. It's a very oxidative, highly oxidative tissue. Of course, the skeletal muscle, depending on your mitochondrial capacity. I mean, if we have been talking in previous episodes on mitochondrial function. If your mitochondrial function is compromised, you simply cannot use lactate, as good as someone who is, on very high capacity or mitochondrial capacity or mitochondrial function. So, of course, the skeletal muscle is one of those tissues that consume not only a lot of glucose but oxidizes a lot of lactate as well, and that's the reason why they control the whole glucose. Which at the end of the day, glucose and lactate is just carbons. So it's just that we've got a massive pool of carbons, and at the end of the day, everything comes down to almost the same, which is how those carbons travel through the body. So a skeletal muscle uses a lot of carbons, of course. It's very demanding, especially when we are exercising. The demands can exceed, like, the shift between being at rest and being during exercise can be, like crazy amount of lactate, more, 500 times more in the muscle that when you're exercising compared to when you are resting. And then something very interesting to me is the brain. I mean, the brain has preferential kind of affinity for lactate. And there are some elegant studies on that when there's a lot of lactate available, the brain can shift its metabolism, and it can use directly lactate and therefore save some glycogen that we still, I think we already talked about this as well. We even if it's in very little pools, we can store some glycogen in the astrocytes. Those astrocytes are the helpers of the neurons, those kind of cells that we use to help. I don't know how to explain that, but to give some kind of support to the neurons. We can store some little pools of glucose there, and when lactate is highly available, let's say you've got a hyperlactatemia in the body, the brain is gonna preferentially use lactate over glucose or over ketones, for example. So yeah, there are different tissues, but I would say those three probably they are the highest in terms of absolute values. They are those who consume more lactate. Then of course, it is very interesting this topic of microbiota, how the lactate is used there to, of course, feed the bacteria and create, some other postbiotics that are very beneficial for the body. Of course, the digestive system, the immune system, they use a lot of lactate as well. But when it comes to absolute numbers, I think those three, the heart, skeletal muscle, and probably the brain, they are high consumers of lactate.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to the glucose slash glycogen sparing role of lactate. We're coming back to that later in the episode, so I wanted to put a pin in that for listeners to pique their interest. What are some causes of high lactate outside of exercise? Because part of, I think, our understanding problem with lactate is our sampling mechanisms, which are fundamentally we sample it in disease, right? So when you're sick and we
Yeah.
see high lactate for whatever reason, and we sample it in exercise contexts. But there, and I think that that's limited our understanding to some degree. So when else? You already mentioned if we're struggling with mitochondrial function, we might have a high baseline lactate, which is a good example of like poor metabolic health. But when else might we see a higher lactate, like a rise from baseline?
Mhm. Well, that's, I mean, again, it's tricky because we measure a concentration. So normally you're going to see an increase on that concentration when your mitochondria cannot clear up that lactate for whatever reason. Um, but the body has a lot of resources to buffer that as well. So it's not a very sensible kind of biomarker, for example, to measure basal stress, because probably you're not going to see. I mean, there's some examples that you can see, and that's my experience, increased basal blood lactate concentration when you are stressed or when someone has a overactivation due to any other things. Like it can be, yeah, psychological or psychobiological stress, or just like you're suddenly, stressed, but it's very hard really to correlate kind of a spike on blood lactate concentrations with other kind of activities that are not exercise or disease. For me, that's hard, and that's the reason why I think the real value of understanding lactate is when there is a stress on the cell, which is significant, that is exercise, for example, and that's where really you exceed the capacity of the cell to process, deliver, and use that oxygen, and that's where you really get that diagnosis. But of course, as you said, there are different states, when metabolic syndrome, or people that cannot who cannot really, let's say, deal with the or very well with the energy production. They have a compromised mitochondrial function. Then, yeah, the basal blue lactate concentration, they are normally increased if you compare them to elite endurance athletes, for example. That's a sign of, in my interpretation, that's a sign of cellular stress, meaning that the cell cannot give kind of exit, or I cannot really use and clear that source of energy that is lactate. And it's very similar, or I understand it's very similarly to glucose. Hyperglycemia is just the same. You cannot buffer that. All the controlling mechanisms, they're not working properly, so you can really or store that glucose or use it as or convert it into energy. So that's what I could say. Then there are, kind of more extreme episodes like a heart attack, for example. That's where, your lactate, when your heart goes into maximal stress, and these, the cells are broken, and that's the reason why you see these, creatine kinase specifics of the heart very elevated in plasma. That's where, lactate goes to the extreme, because at the end of the day, when you have a sepsis, for example, you are about to collapse, the body is reacting with sending as much energy as it can to everywhere, especially to the heart or whatever is happening on the body. And that's the reason why we always use kind of these sentences, or this conversation that, when you see high values in the, if you ask a doctor or someone who is in the practice every day on the hospital, and they see 20 millimoles, they say, okay, just stay here in the hospital because you're having something, you're having a heart attack, or whatever. And for us, in the kind of context of exercise, and especially on the elite level, we know why that is happening, and that's something pretty normal. So it is all about the context, but at the end of the day, you can bring it down into a cell stress.
Yeah.
That's the lactate.
Yeah, and I think we misunderstand stress, or we talk about stress in the popular world, right? Stress can be
Yeah.
good. It's a hormetic stressor, can be good. You come back stronger. It's actually something I've said on this podcast before is that if you looked at things like lactate, heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate, all these things, in isolation from maximal exercise, they would look very similar to a very sick patient and vice versa.
Correct.
It's just the context that matters. And similarly, if you were experiencing those things at rest, you would feel terrible, whereas you feel less bad when you're exercising. Still bad. If you've
Yeah.
got a lactate of 20, you don't feel good no matter what, but
Yeah.
you feel appropriately bad, not inappropriately bad. Whereas if you have a lactate of 20 and you're sitting here talking to me, yeah, you'd feel it. And you know you're very unwell. So it's quite interesting the redundancy that we see, or the shared pathways we see around stress, right? So, but
Mm.
that also speaks to what you said in our first episode, talking about removing stress from the environment and removing stress from the individual to allow them to apply their own stress and adapt to that stress. So
Yeah.
that's how it sort of links back to that. But let's talk about exogenous lactate, because this is an idea that most people probably hadn't thought about. But in the George Brooks work and etc., there's been lots of hints at like, hey, this could actually be a really interesting fuel if we could get it exogenously. And we won't talk about why that's a challenge, but suffice to say, it's a challenge, right? To get this to be delivered properly in doses that make sense, and be absorbed and not cause other problems is a challenge, right? And so we'll come to that in a little bit. But why would it be beneficial? So for listeners who haven't read the science like I have, or like you have, you more than me, but why would exogenous lactate be beneficial in addition to something like carbohydrates?
We don't know really, but we suspect. I mean, as always, when you create kind of a potential new space in science, you're probably coming from mechanisms, then into some anecdotes or evidences, into probably studies in animals or in cells, and then you end up kind of really doing the studies that we normally accept as valid for us, which are in humans or in athletes or whatever. Um, Back in the days, I think George Brooks, who we can consider the father, one of the fathers of the modern kind of lactate, that second life of the lactate, that is not a waste product, but a good thing. He already started to think about that, and probably that was because he saw the real kind of impact or potential impact of lactate in the body. I mean, if it's a source of energy, if it's something that creates more glucose internally, if it's something that signals different pathways that are potentially beneficial to create adaptations related to exercise or health, and if everything that we do in general, like when we exercise or when we fuel a lot of carbohydrates, we end up producing more lactate internally. I think, at least from the common sense, it makes sense to think that why not? I mean, maybe just fueling directly this substrate, which is, by the way, preferential, can be a good source of energy and a good way to trigger different adaptations in the body. And George Brooks, he started with that. Actually, there is a very interesting paper published that is, I think it's called "What Lactate Subtle Means for Sport Nutrition," and he discusses this kind of idea of why it could be a good idea to provide exogenous lactate to the body, both in health and mostly during the exercise. He even tried it, and he patented a couple of solutions, I think, to bring exogenous lactate. But for whatever reason that we can discuss right now, it has been always kind of there, like not really bringing a real solution or a kind of safe or impactful solution in the body. There are different studies, the quantities, etc., and that's where we are. But from the mechanisms that we understand, from the pathways that we know in the literature, if I ask you, David, you can fuel with this substrate that is going to take 2 steps, or you can fuel with this one that is preferential and it goes straight into mitochondria, and on top of that, it's going to make your body to kind of function in a different way. I think you could say I'll go for the most efficient one, I'll go for the faster one, I'll go for the preferential one, and that's really the discussion. Like, it is, we can understand from this angle of literature that we've got around lactate mechanistically, and when it comes to the pathways that we know from lactate, that it can be well, in my opinion and according to science, is the best source of energy for the body, the most preferential source of energy for the body. Why couldn't be a good solution to provide exogenous lactate on that context?
Yeah. Well, okay, that's extensive. So if we are providing exogenous lactate, let's talk about different metabolic states because my understanding is that would have different impacts at in different metabolic states, right? So let's start with at rest. If we supplemented lactate, what do we like? What would we see, or what would we expect?
Hmm. Well, as you know, when you put something into the body, where it goes, it's going to depend on where the blood is going. So, I mean, if I'm exercising my arms or my
Yeah,
upper body and I've got more blood flow into that side, probably I'm going to, whatever concentration I've got of glucose, lactate, or whatever, they're going to mostly go there. That's circulation. Um, at rest, probably let's assume that everything is going to go normal, like you're not activating anything. Lactate is mostly going to be used, first of all, as a preferential source of energy. So when oxygen is available, when the mitochondria is working well, let's say there is a balance between the oxygen that it needs to produce or to transform energy. Uh, some very interesting studies in animals, mechanistic studies, they show that lactate is preferentially oxidized in mitochondria. So simply by doing that, if you are ingesting a kind of a single dose of lactate, uh, I assume that you're going to be using lactate. And what we know is that when lactate goes into mitochondria and it gets oxidized, then it's going to certainly inhibit glycolysis. So it's going to stop a little bit glycolysis, and it can even promote the oxidative capacity. So, translated into a metabolic card, we could probably see higher reliance on what we call fat oxidation, which at the end of the day, as you know, is equivalence of electrons and hydrogen. But anyway, we are going to see, or we should be seeing higher kind of fat oxidation and reduce carbohydrate reliance. And that's something that is documented in tissues like the muscle, in the kind of the whole body of animals and even in some humans, and also in the brain. So when we create hyperlactatemia, we are at rest, and let's imagine that we drink, we ingest enough quantity to make our delivery of lactate high enough. Let's say whatever, this is completely arbitrary, but 4 millimoles of on our blood that goes to the brain, then the brain automatically is going to use preferentially that lactate, and is going to save the glucose that is normally using for those kind of brain demands. And that's what we already discussed, that when lactate goes straight into the oxphos system, it goes straight to be transformed into energy as a preferential source of energy. It also sends a message back to the glycolysis, say, I can suppress you because I'm meeting those demands. Don't worry, you don't need to work hard, and you can save that glycogen for later. Of course, this is explained in a very kind of simple way, but there are many different mechanisms around how lactate is oxidized and how lactate travels. So we can talk about that, but it's not only that the lactate goes there and gets used and that's it. No, there are many different other kind of mechanisms that are in parallel with lactate traveling and being somewhere, and that's the reason why we call it signaling molecule.
yeah. Generally, in physiology, we see this. We see these feedback loops because physiology was
Yeah.
well designed or evolved well or whatever. However you want to think about it, it's done. It's pretty efficient, which is to say, hey, I've got high levels of lactate, therefore I don't need to be burning carbs, right? So it's a pretty classic negative feedback type of loop. But
Mm.
if that's the case and we start supplementing lactate, it says to me there's a couple of really interesting use cases here. So a couple of them you've already mentioned. So one is about brain energy, and then I think straight away to post concussive symptoms, right, and where you have this insulin resistance in the brain and an inability to use carbohydrates. So I think that's really interesting. We've had Tommy Wood on this podcast talking about some similar stuff. So I think that's really interesting as a potential there. I also think there's two potential states that are quite interesting to many of our listeners. One would be carbohydrate loading, which is to say, if we can stop you burning carbs, we may be able to, maybe load less or certainly improve our carbohydrate loading. And then the reciprocal of that, which is recovery,
I
right?
was going to
So
say that exactly, or recovery.
yeah, we're trying to replenish glycogen stores, use less glucose if we can, and so we then preferentially metabolize lactate, and you'll actually see that as physiology to some degree. If you have high lactate post exercise, it will be preferentially used, right? And you'll burn less glycogen, so it's quite an interesting thing to augment that or potentially augment that. But let's
Yeah.
talk about another physiological state, so to speak, which would then be below or in different threshold ranges, right? So below first threshold, would that be similar to what we're seeing at rest because it's below first threshold?
Uh, well, yeah, I think there's something probably we're going to discover as long as we continue with the conversation. But it's something that we know is that lactate behaves differently depending on the metabolic ecosystem of the cell. And that's the interesting thing. That is not only something that works, fat oxidation, we know the limitations, we know the capacities. Glucose oxidation, we know the same. Lactate is somehow like the Joker, you when you play cards, that it can
Yep.
do
Yeah.
everything. A
It's a
little bit
trump
of that,
card. Yeah.
exactly. It can do a little bit of that. That's what I meant before in Spanish. We say the white horse. I don't know why we use that reference anyway. And so yeah, lactate we have seen, and this is from some experiments on our lab and with some different athletes, but and also compare it to some data that is published in animals and some humans as well and cells, that lactate behaves differently depending on the context of the cell. So that's interesting. So as you said, we can, and that was smart from your side, David. I mean, yeah, we know different zones of intensity, whatever. But when it comes to lactate, I think, as you said, very interesting, but very simple, but very interestingly, there are two main domains. Like below lactate threshold, because at the end of the day, that's where lactate is going to be oxidized, and it's not going to, the mitochondria is going to clear that up with no problems. And then above lactate threshold, which is, lactate threshold is defined by a substantial increase on blood lactate concentration, and that means that mitochondria cannot meet those oxygen demands, and therefore it's not oxidizing that amount of lactate, and it gets accumulated in the blood.
So just for clarity for listeners, that's second threshold there, as
Yeah,
opposed to
what
first
we call the
threshold.
second threshold, exactly.
Yeah. So
Exactly.
when we're stepping into basically an exercise, a duration of minutes, our ability to sustain it is minutes, not a long period of time, right? So above, say, like that'd be zones 4, 5,
Yeah, whatever
zone
it
3 in
is.
a 3-zone model. So like, severe exercise domain, like whatever
Exactly.
terminology you want to use, it's hard and unpleasant. So once we get into there, lactate behaves differently than below there.
Exactly. So going to your question below that, yeah, similarly to when you are at rest, but on a different absolute numbers, because of course the demands of the energy are different, and the body is sending more resources to that muscle that is active. For example, the legs, if you're cycling, or if you're rowing, probably the upper body. But is probably going to follow similar rules when it comes to getting oxidized. So I assume from mechanisms that we know, plus the data that we've got, that lactate is mostly used and oxidized, and it contributes to the oxidative phosphorylation, which is the way we transform energy when oxygen is available. Well, always, because there's always oxygen available, but especially predominantly at lower intensities. Okay, so lactate is going to be a contributor of the OXPHOS system, the oxidative phosphorylation. So it's going to go straight in a higher amount, total amount, absolute numbers than when you are at rest into that muscle, and it's going to get oxidized, and it's going to be transformed into energy directly. So because it contributes to the TCA cycle and the whole kind of machinery of transforming energy, probably that is going to send another message that is exactly the same that you can find on rest, that is going to suppress glycolysis. Okay, I'm supplementing the demands that carbohydrates could be meeting. I am the lactate right now. I'm supplementing those demands. So my message to glycolysis is, you can stop. I'm here. I'm discovering this. So the way we see that in a physiological test is that because oxidative capacity is improved and is promoted, we see also higher oxidation of fats, or the equivalence when it comes to electrons and well, the electrons related to fats, and a reduce or a decrease of the contribution of glycolysis. Okay, simply because lactate is getting used. So there is a very elegant paper that I always like to refer on when I talk about this, which is a paper that shows mechanistically how lactate goes straight into, or feeds straight, the TCA cycle independently of its metabolism. Okay, I'll try to explain this. For lactate to be able to go to the mitochondria, normally first it has to you have to break down that glucose into lactate. So the only way that you can create lactate is through the carbohydrate pathway. And the last step is lactate, and that feeds mitochondria. But now imagine that we are bringing from outside of that cell that last product, the lactate, and it goes straight into the oxidative machinery. That is something that we know that is happening, and mechanistically is something that is reported, and that's the reason why you could see someone who is in the right amounts and significantly high amounts fueling exogenous lactate is probably going to show a reduction in carbohydrate oxidation at low to moderate intensities when oxygen is really available and is not exceeding the demands of the mitochondria, and lower reliance on carbohydrates. And that's hypothesis plus some anecdotes, plus some experiments, plus some pilot studies. But of course, that's something that in humans it should be still kind of properly understood. But still, and that's my last point, there are some different studies on how exogenous lactate alters the RQ, or the RER, sorry, which is the respiratory quotient, and that is simply the substrate partitioning in the cell.
Yeah, and so we would classically see a relatively low RER at those levels of exercise intensity, and so this would drop it further, suggesting more fat is being burned, less carbohydrates are being burned, roughly.
Exactly.
But it's a little bit more complicated when we are supplementing, though.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have to ask you, am I explaining this more or less well, or I'm just making loops on my own mind?
No, I mean, listen, like this metabolism isn't simple.
Yeah.
And I think, we've got a range of people who are going to listen to this. There are going to be some people who are in depth in this space and they're going to be following you. And there's going to be a group of people who are like, I have no idea what he's talking about, which is my role here, which is to say, in summary, below second threshold, what it's going to do is you're going to burn the lactate, or it's going to go to, maybe it goes to the liver, depending on the intensity, and gets used for gluconeogenesis, so to create new glucose, right? So you either have glucose being produced as a result of the lactate being used directly, and then you have increased fat metabolism because we're turning down our own glycogen use, right? So we're not going to be using glycogen.
But that's the second point that you said, the Cori cycle that we know very well. So the Cori cycle is that process that happens when the lactate exits the production site. So let's say a type 2 fiber that is producing a lot of lactate, it exits that fiber because it cannot get oxidized there, or it can poorly probably get oxidized there, and it's going to go to somewhere else. And some of that lactate is going to go to the liver and it's going to create more glucose. And then that glucose is going to feed the different tissues. I suspect as well that when exogenous lactate is available on a kind of equilibrium in the body, when below LT, the contribution of that lactate to gluconeogenesis is going to be higher as well. So that's a second element that probably you're going to be using that lactate not only directly as a source of energy, but also indirectly through the liver.
Yeah. So metabolically, we've talked about it. At rest, it's going to do those things. It's going to create. It's going to basically do all those things we talked about. Turn down our carbohydrate use, turn up our fat use, turn up our lactate use, and maybe then go to the liver and produce some glucose that gets used there. Right. So that's at rest, and that will slowly be turned down because remember, physiology isn't a light switch; it's a dimmer switch. That's going to slowly be cranked down and change as we approach our lactate threshold, our second threshold there. And so then above that threshold, and again, remembering these thresholds are not a point in physiology, they're a rough area in physiology, right? So this is going to vary day to day amongst other things. So, that's for another podcast and other times. But above that threshold, right? So now we're counting our time to exhaustion in minutes now. What does the lactate seem to do there, the exogenous lactate?
Good. So we can understand that environment, a new environment above lactate threshold, as an environment where oxygen demands and energy demands are exceeding the capacity to deliver oxygen. Oxygen is becoming a problem, and let's say we cannot really oxidize substrates at the biggest kind of highest rate. Okay, so I think the best summary to understand how lactate operates is lactate always finds the highest efficiency. Okay, so at low intensity, the highest efficiency is relying on fat oxidations because the problem there is the energy when a lot of oxygen is available. But on this new environment, which is high intensity, the problem is the oxygen. And when you are missing oxygen, then the rules of the game change. And now the efficiency is produce more energy for less oxygen. So now efficiency definition at this highest environment, higher environment, or higher demands metabolic environment is different. Now the problem is oxygen, it's not the energy. So how we can convert more energy by using the same or less oxygen. And that's where lactate, it changes the behavior somehow. I'm going to explain it very simple. And it does the opposite. Okay, so the different mechanisms, the buffering capacity that lactate has in the body, because pH is getting more acidic at that element, through the activation and signaling of glycolysis by producing more pyruvate, and through inhibiting the use of fat oxidations, then the reliance on exogenous carbohydrates is going to be higher. Okay, so lactate is going to find higher efficiency on this new environment through promoting carbohydrate oxidation. Why? Because carbohydrate oxidation is much more economical, much more efficient when oxygen is not fully available, when oxygen is the real problem. And to do that, something that we know very well is that when lactate gets accumulated in the mitochondria, it has signaling properties. So it's going to blunt, it's going to reduce, it's going to inhibit the different mechanisms, the fat oxidation, well, the transport and the use of fats from lipolysis. They use, like, essentially using it to convert energy in the mitochondria. So just to summarize, at lower intensities, exogenous lactate is going to be used and it's going to reduce carbohydrate reliance and probably store glycogen and promote fat oxidation. At higher intensities, it's going to do the opposite. It's going to reduce fat oxidation and it's going to promote the carbohydrate oxidation and the functioning of glycolysis. So as you see, probably you tell me if you really understand, like I'm trying to explain, but lactate is going to promote higher efficiency in both environments where the efficiency rules are different. And that's what is, I'm sorry for this word, is fucking amazing from lactate. And personally, I don't understand how that happens. I'm trying to read and make my hypothesis and all that, but I have seen some results guiding us on that direction. I've seen some data on animals. I see the mechanisms, and I think it is pretty kind of plausible to think that this is something that that is true. Again, we still need to find the real kind of. We need to connect the dots and really understand how this is happening. But I think we've got knowledge, anecdotes, experience enough to say that this lactate has exogenous lactate can have this dual behavior, if you want to call it that way.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I find this to be endlessly fascinating. I think that just to clarify, like 100% underline this for listeners who aren't as adept in physiology. At low intensities, the reason that we burn fat is because we're not limited by time, so we don't need energy at a high rate, and we aren't limited by oxygen. So as a result, burning a gram of fat, even if it costs more oxygen, gives us more than twice the energy than it does a gram of carbohydrate. So that's why we use fat at those intensities. As it gets higher, we now have an oxygen limitation and a time imperative. All of a sudden, we start to burn more carbohydrates at those high intensities, basically. And that is more efficient from an oxygen cost standpoint, which becomes the limiting factor, is our ability to get it in and use it, right? And that's what VO2 max is, the amount of oxygen you can use, right? So just to really underscore that, maybe close some loops for people and really make them understand it better there. So we now understand what this does, right? How we, the sort of the magic of exogenous lactate, so to speak. Now to think about using it, how would we use this in addition to carbohydrates? Right? Would we use it instead of or in addition to exogenous carbohydrates?
Well, that's a very good question. I think we have gone through the mechanisms, but we also need to understand the potential kind of effects of that. Like when you save glycogen, what happens? When you provide more energy to your nervous system, what happens? Is that translated into higher performance, into better neuromuscular function? Is that really translated into higher efficiency? Or all those things, we can have some data, but we need to explore them. But as you said, lactate is it can be used in different kind of scenarios with different purposes. So just imagine that I'm training someone and I don't need to fuel big amounts of carbohydrates, but maybe I want to fuel with exogenous lactate because I want to promote exactly what we said, like some more fat oxidation or kind of reliance on fats or reducing my carbohydrate contribution, or I want to see if I can push those kind of signaling properties of lactate into mitochondrial remodeling or mitochondrial biogenesis. So on that scenario, you could fuel lactate, not necessarily for energetical purposes, like not necessarily when it comes to quantitative kind of delivery, but on the qualitative side of things, that I want to modulate my metabolism and I want to give to my cells something that normally they get when they are training Zone 2, for example. That might be one of the applications that I see in the future. We fuel exogenous lactate to promote adaptations. And that's where I call it.
So not as a fuel source, but as a signaling molecule there to augment the stimulus.
Exactly. And that's where I call it the qualitative side of things. I don't know why I call it that way. Maybe we can find another term, but the qualitative is not just like, I need this energy and I provide that energy. No, it's kind of the signaling properties of the lactate. Essentially what we do with exercise, not the only mechanism that could be very, very dumb from our side if we understand this, but one of the mechanisms that we use to adapt from training is essentially lactate. You produce lactate when you train, and that goes into different pathways, and that is a signaling molecule a natural signaling molecule that then you grow, in elements in sites of muscle growth and inflammation. There is a lot of lactate as well because it is a signaling molecule to grow. So that might be what we can call it qualitative properties. But then, as you said, then is the quantitative. How can I use lactate as a source of energy? Lactate has 3.6 kilocalories, a little bit less than 4 per gram, so a little bit less than carbohydrates.
Yeah, it's a little bit less than carbohydrates.
Less than carbohydrates, yeah. But it is much more efficient because, as you know, it's not only that glycolysis takes ATP to break down the glucose, but also all the journey that glucose does in the body, lactate, it bypasses it. Okay, so it's much more efficient. Those 3.6 or whatever it is calories are going to be converted into energy more efficiently. So let's say, yeah, I've got, and I'm going to go to the extreme because I always like to, explain things on the limits. Let's go now to the Tour de France, and we've got there, Tadej Pogacar, Vingegaard, and now Paul Seixas, and I don't know, someone else. I want to believe even my friend Carlos Rodriguez. They're fighting there. Good. That was probably very optimistic, but anyway.
I was going to say, if he can stay on the bike, then maybe.
No, but anyway, you always have to believe in someone that's close to you.
Cool.
Anyway, and they are just there, and they have these kind of they are exploring the limits, and their energy is really kind of on the limit, and they're just about to kind of decide who's winning. On those kind of extreme environments where energy is a problem, we can fuel, and we fuel a lot of carbohydrates. We already talked about that, 120, 150, whatever it is, glucose, fructose. Well, one of the reasons why we fuel that high amounts is to create internally more lactate, as we said, because glucose, part of the glucose that we absorb is converted immediately into lactate. Part of the fructose that we absorb is immediately converted into lactate. So on that scenario, can we use lactate as a third alternative source of energy? Yes. Not only when it comes to providing more energy, but also bypassing some of the kind of mechanisms that we need to absorb, and therefore the limits. For example, the absorption capacity. The glucose is limited by its transporter. The sodium-dependent one, or the GLUT2 in the apical kind of side of the intestine enteral side. The fructose is limited by GLUT5 and the GLUT2 as well. And lactate is something that it travels, again, as the joker in the cards. It travels to the body with high affinity, with almost no limitation, let's say. So that can represent another alternative source of energy for the body that is more efficient and is faster. Probably in a matter of 5, 6 minutes, 7 minutes, that lactate can be completely oxidized in mitochondria. Whereas glucose is going to take whatever, 12, 15 minutes, and fructose is going to take much more. We know this from isotopes studies.
Yeah, and so this is a bit of a review from our last episode on carbohydrates, but the history of carbohydrates was 60 grams of glucose. That was because you sort of topped out the transporters. We then started adding fructose to that because it's a different transporter at the gut, remembering that just because we eat it doesn't mean it's in our body. It has to be absorbed out of our gut. And now we have a third transporter. And so you've already labeled the two transporters for the glucose and fructose, and the third transporter is the MCT transporter. So a monocarboxylase transporter, is that correct? I don't know.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an MCT transporter, which is quite general. The GLUT ones are really glucose related, even though fructose is a GLUT transporter as well. They're very specific to those sort of carbohydrates, whereas MCTs are the MCT transporter as opposed to medium chain triglycerides, which is different again. But the MCT transporter is a little bit more general. So and that's quite interesting. And as you say, therefore, and with lactate, we then have a high affinity for that, right? Which is also important because that means that if there are five things waiting to go through it, the higher affinity thing will go through it because it will sort of be more attracted there. So I think that's really, really important. So now we've got a different way. We can now add different, we can add a third fuel source, right? Or a third, let's call it third substrate to some degree. We've got glucose, fructose, and then we've got our lactate. So what sort of dosages are we seeing or thinking about with respect to lactate? And is that to do with absorption rates or something else?
Before that, I was going to say, we said third substrate.
Yep.
But it is really the first one because it is faster, it is more efficient, and it's preferential. The problem, and that's what links with your questions, is the amount of lactate that we can ingest. We're limited on that. But just imagine a scenario that we could fuel 200 grams of lactate. That could be, in my opinion, in my short experience I have nothing to do with Brooks and these guys that they have been researching forever with lactate, but in my opinion, that could be the way to go. If you could fuel 200 grams of lactate, that would be, just imagine this completely, of course, is not possible. But so that would be the first substrate. The problem is that when it comes to quantities, we cannot ingest 60, 90, or 100 grams as we do with carbohydrates. On top of that, the reason why that third, that we can call it the first source of energy, is interesting is because, we discussed in our episode on carbohydrates that one thing is whatever you ingest, another thing is how you transport that and how you utilize that in the body. Something that for sure is the lactate is always going to be utilized. Okay, so it's always going to be oxidized because it's preferential, and it's always going to be, if not oxidized, converted into more energy, which is glucose. Okay, so it is, that's something that we have to consider on top of that. And even going further, the reason why I think even on that kind of fueling 120 plus whatever lactate you want to add, let's say an real scenario, 120 grams of carbohydrates plus X amount of lactate that we're going to talk right now, we said that lactate is going to produce something in the cell that is going to modulate substrate utilization. So one of the problems one of the biggest criticism behind fueling a lot of carbohydrates is that you promote more endogenous usage of carbohydrates. So you empty yourself faster. Of course, why? Because that's a mechanism to be more efficient. Okay, lactate can probably stop that a little bit because it promotes fat oxidation or oxidative capacities, and it tells the glycolysis, okay, slow down a little bit because I'm here. So especially for that moderate kind of intensity range, I find this very, very useful. If you are taking 120 grams per hour and you're not only using them, but also saving some of them because you're complementing with lactate, then the overall kind of efficiency and the overall kind of the result of that equation is going to be better when it comes to energy balance.
Yeah. Okay. So just to explain that for people, it's a bit of a wicked problem to take high amounts of carbohydrates because as you take more carbohydrate, you burn more glycogen as well to some degree. It's not a one-to-one, it's not linear, but as a result, you kind of have to fuel more and more because you're perpetuating that problem. Lactate potentially prevents that problem, which is to say it will not turn up the glycogen burning as much. It may even spare some of that depending on the intensity that we're going at. So yes, it acts as again, remembering dual role, both energy source as well as signaling molecule.
Exactly. And just to find an analogy that I always, like to bring things down into something that we can see on a daily basis, I could say our car is running on diesel. Okay, that's fine. But now we've got the AdBlue that is making that diesel a little bit more efficient. I could consider in this context, the lactate, exogenous lactate can be that AdBlue. You know what I mean? Like you are adding something that you make your diesel, you can make most or more out of it, efficiency wise, but also when it comes to overall kind of outcome. No? Yep. So that's the analogy that I would use on the cars. Like, of course, I would consider lactate like the the best whatever petrol 98 or whatever it is because it's the best source of energy. But on the diesel, for example, something that you add like that AdBlue that is going to make that diesel is going to make that body, which is that car, more efficient.
Yeah, and so what limits our absorption of lactate then? So you mentioned we're limited by absorption.
Yeah. Let's go then into numbers. Sorry, I made a couple of steps back, but we don't know. As simple as that. No clue. Personally, I have no clue. That also we have to consider that they're not safe, safe, palatable, and insignificant amounts. Solutions that provide lactate on that, like safe, palatable, and insignificant amount. So the research on this is very limited. Yeah, so we can find. Sorry, go.
I was going to say, so we've been limited, and we sort of talked about this already. You mentioned George Brooks has some patents. We alluded to this at the beginning. Like we haven't been able to do this because delivery's been an issue, right? So, and my understanding is it's very similar to ketones, to be honest. Historically, they were used with salts, and the problem with that is you end up with this enormous salt load to deliver the substance there, and that becomes a problem from a salt load perspective. You're not limited. You're really limited by that. So, and that's my understanding to this point has been a lot of the limitation in our delivery of lactate, and therefore our understanding. Because if we can't deliver enough, we can't understand a
Exactly.
like what the upper limits are, but also what's limiting it. Aside from, hey, the salt load is too high here.
Exactly. So that's the reason there is a technological barrier that is stopping us from understanding that. So when it comes to the MCT1 transporter, which is that that transporter that is gonna, in theory, is gonna bring lactate through the enterocyte and to the blood, and that's gonna go into tissues. We don't know if there is a limitation there. As long as we know, for example, carbohydrates, glucose is whatever 60 grams per hour, or fructose can be 30 or 60. We don't know that number. Personally, I don't know that number for lactate. The limitation, as you said, is really on the gastric kind of gastrointestinal issues and the osmotic load that normally lactate solutions are coming with. So the problem we've got here right now is lactate is just lactic acid, and you remove one hydrogen, and that is a very, very weak molecule that you cannot just take it as it is. Lactic acid, you cannot take it. It's not safe. I mean, it's just a pH of whatever 3 or like very acidic pH. That's not going to be absorbed and tolerated by your digestive system. If you put the lactate with something else like the sodium or potassium or salt, that's also good. You can absorb that, and actually one of the best solutions in medical care, and you know this better than me, is Ringer lactate, which is a mix of different kind of electrolytes
and
plus
lactate.
lactate, exactly, and that's a kind of a rehydrating solution. But if you want to take whatever, we're going to go now into numbers, 5, 20, 30 grams, just imagine 40 grams of lactate, then you might be using 15 grams of sodium, which is definitely non-viable. No, it's not feasible. It's not possible. Your gastrointestinal or your digestive system is going to collapse, and that's the problem. That the limitation is going to be probably, well, it is definitely on the absorption through the digestive system of that lactate, and we know that because infusions like lactate clamps or just injecting, I don't know, injecting is the right word, but anyway, infusing lactate into the arterials, for example, it works really well. You bypass the digestive system. It makes different effects. A lot of studies on that, on animals and humans, and the body tolerates that exogenous lactate. It's safe for the body, and it uses. The problem is that gap between orally ingesting exogenous lactate and transporting that into the body.
And it's the same with anything, any substance, right? Drugs, etc. So there are some drugs that we inject, right? So acetaminophen, paracetamol, whatever you want to call it, whatever part of the world you're in, we can give that IV. We can also give it orally. And the dosages and absorption and the kinematics and the what we call the pharmacokinetics, it's all different because there is a bunch of metabolism that happens between your mouth and the bloodstream is the way to think about this. And if we put it straight in the bloodstream, everything's different. So
Exactly.
it sounds like our limitation at this point has been delivery, which because the delivery mechanisms have meant that absorption is limited. We may or may not have a limitation to absorption. We don't know, but at this stage of their delivery mechanisms, we do.
So now quantities, which is the real question. Because of that limitation to bring exogenous lactate into the body, the quantities that they have been studied are very, very low. Like we're talking about milligrams or maybe a few grams of lactate.
And remembering energetically, it is both an energetic precursor or an energetic substrate as well as a signaling molecule, but energetically it's not the same as carbohydrate, but similar. So if we're talking about milligrams of carbohydrates, you wouldn't even notice that, right?
Yeah, so exactly. So we have only studies that they show what is happening, and in some cases you can see some changes and some effects with very low amounts, but they're very low amounts. Like we're talking about milligrams again. Grams, because in some cases you can find like whatever 200 milligrams per kilogram and that is converted into a few grams, but nothing that we can see, this is really making a real impact in the body. On the other hand, we know that infusions that are closer to 10, 15, 20, 25 grams of lactate on a single dose, or for example per hour or per minute, the equivalent per minute, they seem to make a bigger difference in metabolism or different outcomes, such as signaling, partitioning of substrates, performance, etc. So clearly the gap is, until we don't discover anything that enables you to bring grams and higher amounts orally into the body efficiently, safely, in a palatable way, then we cannot open the bucket of lactate. Okay, and that's the real limitation of this. It is not that we don't want to fuel exogenous lactate. If you read about lactate, you're going to get excited about fueling lactate exogenously. The problem is that technically there are barriers, and that's the limitation right now.
So a couple of times in this episode, you've alluded to, we've seen some data. I've seen some data. We've got anecdata, etc. And we've just talked about how keen people would be, probably at this point, or if they've done any reading, to supplement exogenous lactate. How have you seen this data? How are you, how are you seeing all this? Is there something we should know about here?
Well, I've been certainly obsessed, and of course, the inspiration of that obsession has been always Brooks, of course, then Inigo, and my own kind of is following the metabolic kind of pathway, and the how to say that in English, when you are just smelling, how do you say
following the trail.
yeah, following the trail. For 7 years now, let's say, I've been obsessed with, it could be great to exogenously fuel lactate to the body. And that has been a hell of a process, or hell of a journey, of course, because I was thinking, like, if George Brooks was not able to do this, what the fuck I'm going to be doing? I'm just no one. So, but slowly, I found different partners, and then we kept investing on different areas, and we are close to have a solution that can enable this. And when I talk about numbers, and when I talk about anecdotes, it's because we right now experimentally, in studies or pilot studies, we are using significant amounts, high rates of exogenous lactate supplementation. We found a technological kind of, we found a gap, we found a solution, and I still don't know why, because probably that was a mix between serendipity and some smart people around me. But now our experience tells us that, you can fuel significant amounts of lactate exogenously, safely, in a palatable way, with or without carbohydrates, and that can be reflected into something that is cool in the body.
Wow, that's huge. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to test some product. You kindly sent me some stuff, didn't tell me what it was, and I'm trusting enough of you to have just tried it. I can safely say I thought it was a carbohydrate solution. I didn't think it had any. I didn't think there was anything else to it. So what I'm getting at there is, from a taste perspective, a texture perspective, all those things, you have solved those issues. We can't exactly say too much about what that composition of that was, but it doesn't. You've certainly solved that. I noticed no GI issues or anything like that. So it was quite interesting. I used it on a relatively low intensity run, so I would say then I burned a bunch more fat and happy days. But
but I'm gonna say, I mean, really, this is the way I see this, and I partnered with two definitely way smarter people than me, that are Dani Rasa, someone who has been leading, R&D department of Mugarit, that is a restaurant, on the edge of kind of innovation in high cuisine, and Juan Carlos Arbolella, a doctor in chemistry and physics. They are the real smart people behind the technical solution of this thing. And regardless of, that we can have potentially a solution that will need to be validated, of course. I mean, it is very on a very early stages. For me, there is something that I really want to think about, which is this is scientifically something important. I mean, if we really validate this, if we prove that it can be delivered, it can be absorbed, if everything works well, and we kind of we make sure that we have solid foundations to really support this, that's going to be a massive scientific step forward, in my opinion, both for exercise or performance and health and potentially disease as well. So I'm not proud of, we just, well, of course, I'm proud of, is pursuing something with, with the perseverance and finding solutions, which is great. But I really think if we are now bringing something to the science that can enable new kind of areas of knowledge and new conclusions and new opportunities, the three of us, we are scientists. We are so fascinated about this, and that's, in my opinion, the real thing here. That it can be a good solution and a new solution for everybody.
Yeah, and we sort of hinted at some of the use cases today, and I think you've been appropriately skeptical and appropriately modest around the need for validation and all those things. And I think that's true, that not everything goes from rats to humans that well, right?
No,
And
no.
I'd say it's a fraction, it's a magnitude or a portion of a magnitude that would go across. But what I'm getting at there is I think you're going about it the right way, and there is high potential here. But we talked about it in the last episode. Carbohydrates, that research started in the 80s and 90s, and now 30 something years later we are where we are. Lactate research, yeah, okay, we've got some indications, but we're supplementation of lactate is going to be another 20, 30 years, and there's ways we can speed that up. And again, I won't say too much because I have some insight, but you are starting to try and get that happening, which I think is great.
Yeah,
But time will tell. So
yeah. But
and I think you're approaching it the right way in that respect.
yeah, no, I mean, of course, we are scientists, so you always need kind of arguments and foundations to really, say the word and really believe what you're saying, because you have data, and we have done a couple of clinical trials and some pilot studies, and something else is coming probably very soon, and all that. But it's very, early stages of this kind of new area of knowledge. What I could say, something that we always say, science is behind the practice,
Oh yeah,
and
especially in elite sport, it's
exactly.
unbelievably behind. So
Exactly, and the 120 study that we did, for example, that was a good example. The establishment is right now, for the moment, say that 90 grams is the most kind of evidenced amount, but reality that in the Tour de France, they're feeling higher amounts, or the record in the marathon was done fueling 115 grams per hour.
yep.
So what I could say, something that is, in my opinion, or it makes me being very optimistic, is that we have tried that in the field, and we have high elite athletes that they are now not only training but also racing, and proudly I have to say winning races with this solution, which is something that, yeah, maybe you say, I don't know what is happening, how, but in some cases it is working, and it's, at least it's not making any harm. So that's also, for me, I am a scientist, but I'm mostly a practitioner. That's very, very important. So we have explored the limitation of that, the amounts of exogenous lactate that some of our athletes have fueled. It is crazy, like really non-understandable from Aitor myself 1 year ago, and that has impacted positively, or at least neutrally, on their performance.
Yeah.
So that's where we are, and I think that's pretty cool.
I agree. I can't wait to hear more, and I'm sure our listeners won't be able to wait either. And there will be some more coming on this. So, Aitor, thank you for your time today. We really appreciate it. This is super exciting, and congratulations publicly for getting this all happening.
Thank you very much, David, for the space and for the good questions. And yeah, always enjoying these kind of conversations. Thank you.
Yeah. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much.